Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its people, and its history. Today it's a great pleasure to host Professor Kimberly Katz. She's teaching at Towson University, and she published a very important book about the hardly known Jordanian Jerusalem. The book Jordanian Jerusalem, Holy Places and National Spaces was published early in 2005 and still remains one of the very few works dedicated to that period of time. Professor Katz also published, more recently, A Young Palestinian's Diary, 1941-1945, The Life of Sami Amr. From Hebron, Sami also lived some of his years in Jerusalem. Kimberly, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me today.
The only and first question that I ask all of my guests is, what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is the connection? What is your connection to the city?
So my connection really is, it's a research home for me. I don't want to say that I don't have great friends or colleagues, people I've known for 25 or more years at this point. That's certainly true. People are very generous and welcoming and offer great meals and great conversation. There's amazing places to visit and to see and to learn about. All of that's certainly true. But for me, Jerusalem has been a place of research, a place of learning. And I think that it, really started when I was doing my master's thesis research in the first part of the 1990s. Sort of recognizing that there really wasn't much written about the Jordanian period in Jerusalem. You can walk around the city and hear things about different historical time periods and different rulers and buildings that date back to particular rulers, but you don't hear anybody really talking about the Jordanian period in the city. So already as I was doing my master's and studying Arabic and, kind of getting a little bit familiar with the city, it occurred to me that there really wasn't anything, at least in English, that would sort of open up this time period. And in general, there does seem to be much less written about Jerusalem and the West Bank under Jordanian rule, in English for sure. There are some works in Arabic, but generally speaking, I think that there continues to be a dearth in this area. So I made this my research home so that I could learn more about it.
Very interesting. And we're going back to talk about the question of why there are no works dedicated to Jordanian Jerusalem. But if I can bug your memory, what do you remember of Jerusalem in the 1990s? At a personal level, how did you feel going around the city in that particular period of time?
That I think is an interesting period of time. Part of me wishes I might have actually kept a diary now that, in the decade after that, all of a sudden diaries became, much more helpful in trying to understand the city and Palestine and Palestinian lives and whatnot. And there are lots of people who have written about that time period, particularly diplomats who had worked on, the Oslo process and the Declaration of Principles and whatnot. So, we have those kind of elite writings on that time period, but I actually remember the beginning of it, as a period of hope. 1993, the Declaration of Principles were, and the Oslo Accords were signed in Washington, and there was the coming elections for Palestinians in the West Bank, whether or not Jerusalemites were going to be able to participate in this. There seemed to be some hope in all of this, that this was actually going to lead to some kind of meaningful peace. Obviously, there were people on both sides who opposed this, and those people who opposed it, sort of, as is often the case, become very vocal, partly through their voices, but partly through their violence. And violence did become, sort of changed its shape, I think, in the 1990s. So there was this sort of hope matched with opposition to what was actually happening. And I think the opponents, not being one to condone violence, I think the opponents recognized something that, that other people or the hopeful people didn't want to recognize, which is that the process didn't unfold fairly. It didn't unfold with the kind of fairness in the backing, right? The United States had not ensured itself as an honest broker, and there's been a lot of writings on that since that time. But as a result of that, and the U.S., of course, was just playing its continual role of not being an honest broker for decades. But to sort of bring the parties to this very hopeful moment, right, when Israelis and Palestinians had reached an agreement that they signed, on the White House lawn, and all of that seemed very optimistic to a lot of people, I think, to not at that moment, sort of step up and ensure that a fair process unfolded, or that Israel abide by its commitments to withdraw at certain moments, right? I mean, Israel held the upper hand and continued to do so, and the United States continued to back that. And that, so the opponents, maybe their opposition was not exactly to that particular issue, but nevertheless, I think they would have a case to make for unfairness and that the process didn't unfold as it might have been able to. So, it was both that decade, I think, was both hopeful. There was a lot of interest. There was a lot of people working, diplomats and aid workers, and all sorts of things happening. It seemed like the place to invest. Palestinians were returning in larger numbers into the West Bank. I mean, Palestine was going to be built up. And, I think by 2000, September 2000, when Ariel Sharon went up to the Temple Mount, and Israel's internal politics affected how, things were going to unfold over the next decade. It looked like all of that effort and all, people's hopes that there might be something positive out of this, all of this was, starting to dissipate. And that, of course, was unfortunate.
Yeah, looking back, it feels like that decade is so far away given what happened next. And yet it was only 30 years ago. So
Right.
really things have been shaped in many different ways.
Right.
I was wondering, looking at your work about holy places and Jordanian Jerusalem, in general, we open books, we read the narratives. Not many times we ask about the process of research. And I was wondering, how was your experience researching the material in Jerusalem, in the archives, in the libraries, in order to produce your work?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think anybody who does research in Jerusalem knows that it's a complicated place to be, right? You certainly need language skills, and you need to know how to navigate. You need to know how to understand who is in a particular place and where you're going to and how you're going to get there. All of that's actually important, I think, when doing research in Jerusalem. So sort of crossing the unmarked boundaries to get from Palestinian areas where there are some libraries and small archives to Israel's state archive in another part of the city, right? Those are problems that people face every day. Palestinians face challenges every day in navigating the city, but for a foreign researcher, it can be even more challenging, right? Maybe some unwritten rules take time before you figure out what is actually happening. So, so I did a lot of that. But I also want to say that, because the archival situation is so complex, right? That I think, you have to think a bit more broadly about how you manage to write about the Jordanian period, how you do research on the Jordanian period. And that has to do with Jordan's archival situation, right? So a lot of the documents that Jordanians had been keeping from 1948 to 1967, which is the time period that my book, Jordanian Jerusalem, focuses on, those documents had actually been captured by Israel during the 1967 war. And as a result of that, they were inaccessible. So, Israel kind of collected these documents and made them part of their own Israel state archives. And there's a whole host of politics around archival records. Incidentally, there was recently, you probably remember this, Roberto, an article in the 2016 Jerusalem Quarterly. Musa Bouderi wrote about this this issue of scholars gaining access to the sources that particularly relate back to this time period of the Jordanian documents and what happened to the Jordanian documents. And of course, Israel also captured the records of the Egyptian administered Gaza Strip at that point. And I think that what we probably don't know is the extent of the records that were lost to Jordan as a country and to Jordanian and Palestinian history as a result. We also don't know what kind of restrictions Jordan might have placed on such materials, but because those documents never made it into the Jordanian National Archives, we'll never know. Some Israeli scholars, as Musa Bouderi outlined, and something that I had encountered along the way in doing the research for this, reading the books, as you mentioned, there are a number of Israeli scholars who have been able to use those documents, Israelis who served, who were both scholars and served the state in some way, whether in the military or in a civilian context. And so I think the first big book on focusing on the 1948 to 1967 period, he limited it to 1949 to 1967, was Amnon Cohen's book on political parties in the West Bank under the Jordanian regime. So he, had been one of these people, scholar. He argues very much that his book is a scholarly book, and I think that it is, but he also had access to materials that later scholars, non-Israeli scholars, didn't have. And he's not alone. There were a number of scholars from, Avi Plaskov, who wrote a lot about Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, Shaul Mishal, who wrote a lot about this particular period, right? So Israelis have been able to rely on historical records that others have not been able to rely on, including Jordanian scholars, right, whose government was sort of responsible for that material, and Palestinians as well, about whom or who were living in and may have been in the offices, staffing the offices in which that archival material, what would become archival material, right, the documentary evidence at the time, would have had little access to that material. So there is scholarship by Israelis in English about this time period, not specifically focusing on Jerusalem, right? I think that you're right in noting that my book is alone or very lonely in being a book that focuses specifically, and a monograph-length work that focuses specifically on the Jordanian period in Jerusalem. But there is other work that addresses it. There, of course, has been some writing by Arab scholars on the time period, but again, not specifically just on Jerusalem. So a short book published by Passia in 1993 on the Jerusalem municipality, generally speaking, which includes a section on Jordan, but it, again, is not the Jordanian period in Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem, and Jordan played a particular role. Jerusalem-born Hazem Nusseibeh wrote a book on the contemporary political history of Jordan in Arabic that focused on the 1952 to 1967 period. And again, it doesn't focus specifically on Jerusalem, but it does include, that is his birth city, and that factors into his analysis. And sort of incidentally, I hope to delve a little bit more deeply into Dr. Nusseibeh's writings, including his 2009 memoir, which that came out 4 years after my book was published. But his 2009 memoir is titled Jerusalemites, A Living Memory, where he gives his kind of long view on his birth city, but he also includes things that are of interest to my current research. He discusses in it, not in such a long form, but again, he briefly mentions that he was the chairman of the Jordanian delegation to the Mixed Armistice Commissions in the early 1950s. And so that may give me some cause to rethink a little bit about what I wrote in my 2005 book. But it may also be helpful for my current research, which deals with issues of border crossings in the early 1950s. And so the Mixed Armistice Commission that he served as the head of the Jordanian delegation to the commission, he was involved in. I recently also had reason to meet Dr. Nusseibeh again in Amman in 2019. I had initially met him during my dissertation research in the late 1990s. He's a much older man now, so the opportunity to really speak to him, we were both attending a lecture, the same lecture, And so I took the opportunity to just greet him and say hello and thank him for his work and for meeting with me earlier on. I had hoped to ask him a little bit more about this issue of the Mixed Armistice Commission. He referred me to Jordanian Ministries, which is, I probably should not have bothered him at that point in his life. He was a very kind man, and so I thanked him for his help and all. But I think to get at your overall question, I think you were sort of leading in this direction about why more people have not done research in the Jordanian period, just really has to focus on this issue of access to sources. Now, of course, some of that also has to do with who's interested in going to Jordan or Jerusalem, right? Jordan, of course, became a place that was more and more accessible and attractive to researchers, maybe more attractive because it was more accessible over the past decade since the start of the Arab uprisings in 2011, where countries such as Syria and Egypt became much harder to travel to and harder to live in and spend long periods of time there. And so, I have spent time in Jordan over the past 10 years as well. And what seems to be the case is not that people are studying Jordan and its role in Jerusalem and the West Bank more, but they're studying what happens to Jordan as a result of conflicts and problems elsewhere. So, people in different disciplines, whether they're economists or anthropologists or whatnot, they're studying the refugee issue in Jordan anew. So not Palestinian refugees in Jordan and the Jordanian West Bank, but Syrian refugees, right, as a result of the Syrian uprising. Of course, people are also studying Jordan's history and traditions and politics through arts, bread politics, urban issues, gender, and of course, Jordan attracts a lot of scholars working on archaeology. But I think there's only one book, one scholar, Elena Corbett, whose work relates a lot to my 2005 book. She published a book in 2014 called Competitive Archaeology in Jordan, with a subtitle narrating identity from the Ottomans to the Hashemites. And in that book, she explores Jordanian identity through a framework of core and periphery. And she goes back to the late Ottoman period when European powers were more and more interested in Palestine and the Holy Land. And I think we could look at Palestine as the kind of core and Transjordan as the periphery at that time. That's what she notes in the book. But she argues for an inversion of that more traditional view of the Holy Land core, the Palestine Holy Land core and Transjordan as a periphery, when Jordan came to control the holy places in Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank, Bethlehem and Hebron from 1948 to 1967. So that is when she argues Jerusalem became a Holy Land core. And she, so it's a really interesting work, but it doesn't focus just on the Jordanian period, although Elena relied on some of my research, that I had done more than a decade earlier. So this was, a really valuable way, I think, to me to see it, expanding how to think about Jordan's role in Jerusalem and its relationship to Jerusalem and to West Bank holy places. But of course, she continues on with a longer look. So not only does she start much earlier than my book does, but she also expands it till much more recently to look at Jordan's role in with regard to Jerusalem and its relationship to the holy places after 1967, when Jordan had to rethink and reconstruct identity following the loss of Jerusalem and the West Bank to Israel as a result of the June 1967 war.
This is fascinating, and it brings me to ask a question. Jordan came to control Jerusalem as a result of the 1948 war, and obviously they controlled the old city and what then became to be known as East Jerusalem. And you mentioned the question of your holy places is central to Jordanian sort of legitimacy to control, Palestine in general, but certainly Jerusalem. So I was wondering if you can take us through a short journey of Jordanian Jerusalem. How was the city between 1948 and 1967?
So it's interesting, as we were talking about before, maybe even before you started recording, we were talking about diaries and memoirs, maybe at the start of the interview. And it's interesting that wasn't a focus of my research because that wasn't sort of in vogue in scholarship at the time. There were not, they were not yet, these diaries that have kind of come to light were not yet published. And so we didn't exactly know. I did talk to individuals, right? I mean, Hazem Nusseibeh was one of them. The link between my first book and my second book came as a result of doing research with an individual kind of usual or unusual story for how one finds one's next research project on an airplane. I met an older Palestinian whose family was living in Jordan. And he heard me speaking Arabic on the plane, and we ended up talking about my research and what I was doing. And he had some material from the 1948 to 1967 period of the kind of material that was available for me to use. So on the one hand, I mentioned that the archives were particularly challenging, maybe even difficult. So I had to rely on a variety of other kinds of sources. And so while diaries were not yet, I think, so much on the radar of PhD students in the late 1990s, I was able to find a lot of things, a lot of visual sources. And so visual sources combined with some, British archival materials, with some newspaper archival sources. And then I think in some of the venues in which I was able to, or ways of representing Jerusalem, right? So that included things like postage stamps and revenue stamps. And it included tourism, of course, but it also included pilgrimages, papal pilgrimages in particular. It included renovations of holy places. That those kinds of materials seem to be a little bit more accessible. So I remember, and again, now I have to say that most of my research for my dissertation, and which became my book, I did in Amman. And so once I kind of recognized that there was a lot of stamps that had images of holy places on them, one can kind of begin to step back and see what institutions are doing to represent the country. And it became a little bit complicated, but at the time, there had been a postal museum that was accessible, connected to the postal ministry. That has since changed. So, I was in this kind of moment where, these things, one could simply go into the postal ministry and which had on the ground floor an exhibition of the history of postage stamps for the kingdom, which included this 1948 to 1967 period, and then, delve a little bit more deeply into what was happening with regard to postage stamps, which is kind of, in some ways that in and of itself is an interesting story because it tracks Jordan's, as historians were looking for change over time, and stamps changed over time with how Jordan used them and to demonstrate its connection or its control over holy places or its affinity or the identity that it was sort of creating for Jordanians with regard to holy places. So prior to the 1948 war, the Arab League had already issued a resolution that was going to deal with, support for aid to Palestinians, Palestine aid. And so the Jordanians were not alone in issuing, this kind of stamp, but they issued a Palestine aid stamp in 1946 after this resolution passed in the Arab League. And it was supposed to be a stamp series whose revenue, when you buy it, the revenue would then go to help Palestine and Palestinians, dealing with the circumstances at that time. And then the stamps went through a kind of process where they had an overmark on them, an overprint on them that read Palestine. So, there's a sort of deeper connection being made here. And then the aid stamps were sort of recognized to be used for all of Jordan after Jordan had taken control of the West Bank and Jerusalem. Then they were overprinted with something that said waridat, or revenue. And so there's this way of looking at how even just something that seems as simple as a stamp, right, comes to have a lot of different messages over time. And then those stamps ultimately were taken out of circulation. And other pressing concerns came in the few years after the 1948 war had ended, and Jordan came to control the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem, including all of the holy places. And I do from time to time mention the holy places that appeared on visual representations, whether in Hebron or in Bethlehem, but they weren't the focus of the book. But by 1951, after 1 year earlier, Jordan had legislated the the unification of the West Bank and the East Bank in the Jordanian parliament, with speeches by King Abdullah at the time about the significance of all of this. In 1951, there was again a stamp series that was issued, and I think it's a really beautiful and kind of unusual stamp because it's a map, basically. I mean, it has the Dead Sea and it has the Jordan River. And on one side, it has, on the western side, the left side of the stamp, it has an image of the Dome of the Rock. And on the east side, or the right side of the stamp, it has the treasury in Petra. So, and on the, you know, and then it has a big kind of, a little bit of wording on it. It says, Zikra Wahdat al-Urdun, right? The unity of, them in commemoration of the unity of Jordan, right? So it's sort of, it's almost like, I think I wrote in the book, it's kind of like the Jordan River is stitching these two parts of territory together, right? So now, you know, there had never been a political entity distinct like that you could draw and create a map and an image and whatever. And here the Jordanians had done it, and this is a reflection of unity. So I think stamps were really an interesting way for the Jordanians to demonstrate, you know, how they viewed the territory that they now controlled, which was, you know, very significantly included holy places. Postage stamps were not the only place where visual representation could circulate in society. And stamps, by the way, are important because although it's not really the case in the United States, and I don't know that it was the case in the United States even in the 1950s, but stamps demonstrate purchase of payment for something. So if you paid a tax on something, you might have a stamp to, you know, that needed to be added to a document, right? And so, you know, they circulated not just because you were mailing a letter, right? They circulated in society because it was useful and for administrative purposes.
We are taking a short break, and I would like to remind you to follow us on our Facebook page, Jerusalem Unplugged, and to interact with various posts. And if you have suggestions for people that you want me to interview, please get in touch. Also follow us on our Twitter account and Instagram, and subscribe to the podcast. Just click follow or subscribe to the various platforms you are listening to. Thank you for listening.
But another area where Jordan could demonstrate its control over holy sites was on banknotes, on money. And, you know, in the very cash-based economy that was Jordan, and that still remains considerably, although arguably I think credit cards or debit cards are now making a stronger showing for good or for bad, right? But banknotes were another way that Jordan could demonstrate its control over holy places. But unlike stamps, which already at the beginning of the 1950s bore holy places, bore Jerusalem's holy places, it wouldn't be until 1959 that Jordan was able to issue its own banknote series. That was the first one in the post-British Mandate era, right? The British really controlled the issuance of banknotes. And it took until after the assassination of King Abdullah and ultimately the ascension of King Hussein to the throne in 1953, and he weathered a difficult next several years. And it was not until 1959 that a banknote series appeared in which you had an image of two West Bank, sort of Jerusalem West Bank holy places. One was included the Dome of the Rock, and the other included the baptism site in the West Bank. And that in and of itself is kind of interesting, this, you know, this identification of particular sites, right? So in the 1950s here, we see the baptism site in the West Bank, but many decades later, when, you know, after Jordan had lost control over the West Bank and its holy sites, there has been the discovery of a rival baptism site on the East Bank, which eventually gained the recognition and legitimacy of the Pope and other significant Christian religious figures. Right. So, and this is, of course, not the only site that has competition for its ancient legitimacy and its modern validity. There are lots of competing holy sites, but this, I think, is one of the things that, of course, Elena Corbett mentioned in her book later on, that Jordan then later on, had discovered a new archaeological site that connects to Jesus or connects to Christianity through the idea of baptism, and that it now appears in publications and tourism, whatever, in Jordan up until today. So there was and remains a lot of ways of thinking about how Jordan can demonstrate at the time in the 1950s and 60s its control over holy sites. There are a few other places as well, if you think that your listeners would be interested in hearing where Jordan did this.
And I want to move to the question of a diary that you discussed in your second book. But I just want to say here that it's fascinating to see that we tend to think about the history of Jerusalem and Jerusalem always through building, obviously people, politics, and we forget about the question of legitimacy. And as I'm browsing pictures of Jordanian stamps between 49 and 67, there is entire collections dedicated to Al-Aqsa, but also to Christian holy places. Not to mention that I found a stamp dedicated to the first anniversary of Pope Paul VI visit to the Holy Land. So it's fascinating how Jerusalem attracts also the question of legitimacy through symbolism.
Yeah.
One thing that I want to notice is that the end of Jordanian rule also coincided with the destruction of the Maghrebi Quarter. And this is a teaser for upcoming podcast where we will investigate the Maghrebi Quarter, the life in the quarter, but also the question of the memory and how it disappeared from essentially both the Jordanian and the Israeli historiography. It looks like once the Maghrebi Quarter was gone in 1967, then no side had an appetite to talk about it. But what I have appetite to talk about it is the diary that you eventually published later, a young Palestinian's diary, 1941-1945, the life of Sami Amr. Sami Amr was from Hebron, and yet he spent some time in Jerusalem, and also parts of the diaries were written in Jerusalem. Can you tell us who was Sami Amr?
Yeah, thanks for promoting this as well. And it's kind of interesting because, how I got to this book project actually stems from the first book, right? I met Sami Amr's eldest son, whose name is Samir, Dr. Samir Amr, as I was finishing up some of the research for this particular book on Jordanian Jerusalem. And he had more of the kind of visual artifacts that I was mentioning to you. He had some tourist brochures from the time period, which also, again, Jordan had a program, and I spent some time with the director at the time of the Jordan Tourism Board. His name was Ghalib Barakat. I think he may be deceased at this point. He was fairly old at the time. But, so promoting Jordan touristically through holy places was also pretty significant, and that is something that I do talk about in the book. But when I had met Dr. Samir, and I talked to him about my book project and what I was doing, he said he had some of these tourism brochures, and if I wanted to see him, I should feel free to come to the family home, which I did, right? And that was kind of an entryway. And for years, he just followed my research. He grew up during this time period. But by 1962, he and his family had moved to Amman, to the East Bank. They were living in Hebron, but he grew up during this time period, so he knew something about it, and he had some artifacts. But several years after we had made our initial acquaintance, we had been in touch for a number of years. He mentioned to me that he had his father's diary from the World War II period, and was I interested in working on it? So, of course you're like, wow, this would be great. And so I headed over and, of course, was invited for a delicious lunch of Munzaf to go see the diary. And it was a really wonderful opportunity to meet the family and to see the diary and what the diary was all about. And at the time, of course, I didn't know anything about Sami Amar himself. I didn't even, I knew the family a little bit. As I mentioned, Samir is a medical doctor, so he, and I would say a very good amateur historian. He's the kind of person you want as a research assistant, because he keeps a lot of material and he holds on to it and he knows a lot about it and he's interested in it and he reads a lot. So he was a great interlocutor for learning more about his father. And I took a look at it and I realized that it had great historic value because we were starting. So he introduced me to the diary in 2004. And we were just starting to see something on diaries come up. More diaries were coming to light. They were starting to be published, right? One can think of Salim Tamari and Assam Nassar's work on Wasif Shohariya, for example. And there were others, right, that were starting to come to light. So this seemed like a real opportunity because Sami was from Hebron and he grew up his early years in Hebron. And at the time that he wrote, he really was nobody particularly significant. His father had died when he was young. His father had been a tax collector under the Ottomans and died when he was quite young. So the family had some struggles and challenges, financial struggles and challenges, plus his mother was now raising 5 children alone. I think 5 children, yeah. So as I came to learn more about Sami during his World War II writings, I also, of course, learned from Samir what he would go on to do. And he was, I think indicative in many ways of Palestinians growing up in the time period. He completed the 7th grade. That was fairly common at the time, when he was 16 years old. And that also was not uncommon because people sometimes worked and came in and out of school when they could complete it. And so 16, I think, was not necessarily unusual. But at 16, he moved to Jerusalem and he sought to kind of find his way in the world. He would have liked more education, wasn't able to get it. So there is the theme of education running through it. And he would ultimately work for a British office. He worked for something that in Arabic was kind of hard to decipher. It was called Da'irat al-Nafi, and Nafi, of course, has no Arabic root. But it stood for, Arabs had Arabized the English acronym for the Navy, Army, Air Forces Institutes, and they called it Da'irat al-Nafi, the Department of the Nafi. And so he worked for this, was basically the canteen services. And in that sense, we get, his life in Jerusalem, we get a sense of what his work for a British office was all about at a particularly difficult moment, right, World War II. For young people who were trying to make their way, who have limited education. He had some English, right, because the education in the Mandate period included enough English so that Arabs could, serve in some capacity, but not enough to raise insurrection or nationalist agitation or uprising. Right? So he had limits on all of this. He changed jobs. He talked about his life renting rooms in Jerusalem, about relations between different groups of people. He also had a lot of anxiety, maybe anxiety is too strong, nervousness around girls and women, right? So he writes about that a lot in his diary. He rented a room from an Italian woman whose name was Aldo, and she, during World War II of all things, right, an Italian woman living in Jerusalem during World War II when it's under British control. She was good to him in a lot of ways, but she made him nervous because she couldn't tell if he was being motherly or kind of coming on to him. There's like he talks about sort of being trapped in this thing that he doesn't quite understand. So I think, and he also writes about the rooms that he lived in. One of them is kind of almost like a bomb shelter, in fact, where he writes that he can only see a little bit, he can only see people's legs below the knees from the window of this small room that he was renting, like a basement apartment, a basement shelter, not entirely clear. So he talks about shoes and socks that people are wearing right? So there's a lot of detail, but a lot of interest from the perspective that we're able to get from his life in Jerusalem. But you asked about who he was, and after this experience, he went on to work. He wanted to learn the trade of welding, and he had a cousin who was involved with the Communist Party, and it's possible that he was sort of thinking a bit more about nationalism. It's hard to really tell. He ended up moving into working for a British Mandate office. From that, he had a job in welding and making, these barrels for the military during the war. And then he sort of left that as his personal circumstances were beginning to change, and he became engaged to a cousin whose father was prominent in Hebron affairs. And he ultimately got a job in a British Mandate office that became connected to the Jordanian Ministry of the Interior. So a local office of the Jordanian Ministry of the Interior after the war in 1948. And he stayed there for a while, moving his way up in the Ministry of the Interior, and ultimately left when things got a bit challenging in around Black September. And then he went on to work in the private sector in real estate and did fairly well. And when I met his son on an airplane with his wife and family in 1999, Sami had died 1 year just before that. And I never, unfortunately, got the opportunity to meet Sami, but I feel like I know him very well because I delved really deeply into every word that he wrote in his diary. And I asked Samir and other family members. I mean, I interviewed Sami's youngest sister, who's now deceased, but she lived long enough to see the English version of the diary, which has a very beautiful cover that the University of Texas Press did, including his picture from his British Mandate era passport. So this is this young guy wearing a suit and tie, very handsome guy. So his youngest sister did get to see that. Unfortunately, his wife did not. So I had also interviewed her, and she died before the 2009 publication of the book. So that was pretty sad. I was also very sad that they never got to see the book published in in Arabic. That took a number of years later. It came out in Arabic. The first publication, the first edition of the Arabic version came out in 2017, and it has been published in the second edition just recently. So I'm glad to know that there's interest in the Arabic diary, which is probably one of very few sort of weirdly translated diaries. So the diary itself was always in Arabic, and I translated it into English, and I wrote about it in English. And when the book was translated into Arabic, the original diary manuscript was used and transcribed so that it could be published in printed form. So it is the original diary, right? It's not a retranslation of my translation of the diary. It's the original diary. But what I wrote, including the voluminous number of footnotes, because both the diary needed annotations and, some of what I was writing needed annotations. So anything I wrote, that was translated into Arabic, and I'm glad to know that it has some interest and enough to warrant a second publication, a second edition.
And I really hope this may serve as some sort of a push, particularly for those listeners that may, connected to Palestine or have families in Palestine, to look into some old boxes, and sometimes you can find something which you never thought could be valuable, but actually is extremely important for historians in order to rebuild and write about the neglected history, particularly of those periods that you've been working on. Jerusalem under Jordanian rules, we don't know much about the city. Similarly, about the period of World War II, there's so much political history, but so little about the social history of the city, the interactions between the communities. And so even this, the glimpse of history that we have through the diary here helps us to understand the nature of a sort of intercommunal relations between people. And I think this is very important for us and all of us that love Jerusalem.
To tie back to what we were talking about earlier with the issue of archives and sources, I mean, as you say, couldn't be more important to gain access to people's private papers. And there has been a push, right, as you know, and the Jerusalem Quarterly has been doing some very good work on bringing these diaries, or at least excerpts, or scholarly analysis of them to light. But in light of the fact that, particularly from the 1948 to 1967 period, not just from Jerusalem, but all of the cities and villages of the West Bank, there is, archival material is just simply difficult to get access to, right? It is either within the Israel State Archives, which is now even less accessible than it had been. And I will say, Jordan's National Archives has improved over the decades, right? They built a whole new building and archive and library building not far from Jordan University, and they've been digitizing a lot of material. But I mean, I think for this particular time period, because the records were in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, and those records, there was no collection of all the records. Quick, let's get them back to the East Bank because war is coming in 1967. That didn't happen. So those records are lost and, difficult to access. And while there is some accessibility, it's limited. So private papers, diaries, letters, they probably couldn't be more important than they would be for this particular period.
One last question. You mentioned earlier your new project about crossing borders. And I was wondering if you can share a little bit of this new work that may see the light in the coming years, hopefully earlier.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I hope I'm not the only one whose research has been derailed over the last year of the pandemic. But anyway, yeah, I do have some records that deal with border crossings and people who are arrested for those border crossings. And so what I'm trying, and it's actually this is a sort of move into more work on Hebron and the Hebron district, right? So there's this kind of geographical progression of my initial, my first major work, my first book being on Jerusalem, and the connection to that work, right, through Samir Amar, the son of the diarist whose diary I translated and published. His interest in what I was doing kind of led me to his father's diary, and his father's diary led me to search for things, again, in the Israel State Archives, in the Jordanian National Archives, wherever I could, to find materials. And, another reminder, or, it wasn't that this was new to me, but a reminder that scholarship on Hebron is even less, right, available in English, and not overabundant in Arabic either, or Hebrew, right? I mean, the works that appear tend to focus very much on the holy places in Hebron, but again, not so much on the social history, people's lives, or even their connection to the administrative apparatus in the city, right? So I think, the idea that I can contribute something on what happened to people's lives in this, again, post-1948 period, and their connections to their homes and when they ended up on the Jordanian side of the border. And again, I think border studies is becoming something that scholars of the Middle East, historians of the Middle East, are delving more and more into, right? I would say the last 10 to 15 years, maybe there's been more interest in borders, where I think it had long been the domain of U.S. historians and the southern border and issues around the Southwest in particular. But we're now seeing more of that in a lot of different ways, and I do hope that I'm able to make a contribution in published form at some point soon.
Kimberly, thanks a lot for being with us here at Jerusalem Unplugged today.
Thank you, Roberto. The pleasure was all mine.
Your insight about Jordanian Jerusalem tells us that there's a lot that we don't know about the city and its history and its people. I would like to remind all our listeners, if you're from Jerusalem, or if your family is from the city, perhaps dig into old boxes. And if you find something, a diary, a letter, remember you're probably sitting on a treasure. Make it public. Get in touch with historians, with people that may value what you have been preserving for years or decades. Once again, thank you, Kimberly, and remember to follow us on our various platforms. Our Facebook page, please like us and follow us. Also our Twitter and Instagram accounts. Thank you. Until the next podcast.